Okay, so welcome back to the show. I'm gonna start out this week by telling you all of the fun names I had for this episode. I had a lot of fun playing with this one, and I don't know. There's so many good ones. So this episode was almost called "That's Happening: A Brief History of Panic and Pine." Wood, Don't Fail Me Now. The Council of Wood Has Spoken. Or what the ultimate title became, which is Please Respect My Superstition. Just wanted to take a few minutes to thank those listening around the globe, those who pay attention every week, the people that have sort of commented, or the people that have liked it or subscribed to the episode. Also, I want to give a huge shout out to the person on YouTube that took a second to comment on one of my videos almost directly after I uploaded it. It was very, very sweet of you. So thank you so much. And obviously, I hope you're still listening. Let's begin. Welcome to my latest fixation. I'm Joshua, and I have a habit of digging into things that don't quite make sense. Think of this as a cabinet of curiosities for the beautifully bizarre. From lonely cryptids wandering through the static, to horror, gaming, obscure history, and the strange little piece of human connection. This is where we take a closer look at all the odd little things that don't quite add up. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's see where this one takes us. You've probably done it 100 times without thinking. Said something hopeful, then knocked on wood. It's a small gesture that almost disappears. A tap on a table, a rap on a door frame, a quick touch on the nearest wooden surface, usually performed with the confidence of someone pretending they are not, in fact, slightly worried about fate. And that may be the whole point. It's one of the smallest rituals we have, and yet it carries a surprising amount of meaning. People do it when they say something good is happening, when they mention luck, or when they feel they may have just jinxed themselves by speaking too soon. I've been healthy all year, knock on wood. The car's been running great, knock on wood. Everything's going so smoothly, knock on wood. We say it so casually that it can feel like a punctuation. But behind that tiny motion is a much older story. One that runs through pagan groves, Christian symbolism, children's games, and the human need to feel protected from the future. In other words, this is not just about wood. It's about anxiety and excellent timing. To understand why people still do this, we're going to have to go back to a world where trees were not just scenery. They were part of a sacred landscape. They could be living presences, places of power, or maybe even something that was listening. Which, to be fair, is more than most of us can say about a coffee table. But before we get to theories, it helps to slow down and notice the feeling behind the gesture. Knocking on wood is rarely dramatic. No one announces it with a trumpet fanfare. It usually happens in half a second, almost as if the hand moves before the mouth has finished a sentence. That speed matters. It suggests something deeper than a deliberate belief system. It feels like a reflex, like habit, like a kind of emotional insurance policy purchased at the last possible second. And that's why the phrase survives. It is small enough to fit inside conversation, but charged enough to feel meaningful. A person can say it while laughing, while worrying, or while trying not to seem worried at all. In that sense, it is a perfect little human compromise. Part joke, part ritual, part plea to the universe not to get ideas. So if you approach knock on wood from a pagan perspective, it stops sounding like a throwaway superstition and starts to feel like a habit that remembers something. Not consciously, not clearly, but persistently. Like a gesture that outlived the belief that gave it meaning. In the ancient world, trees were not just part of the landscape. They were places. Not empty places either, occupied ones. Sacred groves appear again and again in early sources, described less like a collection of plants and more like thresholds. Spaces where something lingered, where the air felt different, where you might lower your voice without quite knowing why. A tree, on its own, already carried a kind of quiet authority. It stood longer than a human life. It watched seasons repeat. It rooted itself in the earth and stretched towards the sky, as if it belonged to both. In many traditions, that made it more symbolic. It made it connective, a living access between the layers of the worlds. So, touching wood, knocking on it especially, would not have felt random. It would have felt like reaching out. Not dramatically, not like a ritual carved in stone, just a small physical acknowledgement. I know something is here. Even when the tree is cut and shaped into beams, doors, tables, the material itself was not always understood as empty. Wood could still carry a trace of what it had been, a residue of life, a presence, or attention, enough at least to make it worth addressing. Folklore leans into this idea. Trees are rarely alone in these stories. They're inhabited, guarded, watched over. Sometimes helpful, sometimes not, but rather neutral. To knock on wood, then, may once have been a way of getting the attention of whatever listened from the other side of the surface. A small request, a quiet correction, a hedge against being noticed in the wrong way. Because that's the other piece of this. In many older belief systems, saying something good out loud was a little risky. To declare your luck, your health, your safety, your plans was to risk attracting attention. Not all attention was kind. A quick knock interrupts that moment. It breaks the line of speech, adds a physical gesture, and says, without quite saying, don't take that too seriously, don't hold me to it. Today, it passes almost unnoticed. A tap on a table, a knock on a door frame, half habit, half joke, but the shape of it is still there. Speech followed by contact, statement followed by acknowledgement. From a pagan perspective, what survives in knock on wood is not just superstition. It's the echo of a world where nothing was entirely inert, where trees were not background, but witnesses, where even a small gesture might be a way of staying on good terms with whatever shares the space around you. And if that feels a little poetic, a little eerie, that's probably because it is. The belief faded, the gesture didn't. Now, the Christian explanation works a little differently, but it circles the same human instinct. Don't get too certain. In that framework, speaking confidently about a future can feel spiritually risky, not just because life is unpredictable, but because certainty itself edges towards pride. The knock becomes a small correction, a way of stepping back from your own words. Even now, when most people aren't thinking in explicitly religious terms, the gesture still carries that feeling. Slow down, don't push your luck. Remember, you're not in control. From a more explicitly Christian perspective, knock on wood can also be read as a reinterpretation of something older, filtered through the image of the cross. Because in Christianity, wood is not neutral. It remembers something. It points, however faintly, to Calvary, to the wood on which the central drama of the faith takes place. In that sense, touching wood can become less about luck and more about proximity. Not to the tree, but to the cross. Not to nature, but to protection, sacrifice, and divine mercy. Christianity has a long history of inheriting gestures and quietly changing their meaning. The movement of the hand stays the same, but what it reaches toward shifts. What may once have been an appeal to something in the tree becomes, in a Christian setting, a reminder of something beyond it. The wood no longer holds a presence on its own, it points elsewhere. But that shift comes with a built-in tension. Because from a stricter theological angle, there is always the risk that the gesture slips back into something it's not supposed to be. If knocking on wood starts to feel like it works on its own, if the protection seems to come from the object or the motion itself, then it stops being a sign and starts becoming a charm. And Christianity has never been especially comfortable with charms, especially when they start wearing the disguise of faith. So the meaning of the gesture becomes strangely fragile. It depends entirely on what the person thinks they're doing. The same knock can be a quiet acknowledgement of dependency on God, or a half-serious attempt to manipulate fate. Outwardly identical, inwardly very different. You can almost hear the disagreement if you listen closely enough. One voice saying, "It's just a habit," another saying, "Nothing is ever just a habit." The gesture sits right in that uncomfortable middle space, too small to examine closely, but too persistent to disappear. From this angle, knock on wood becomes less about the wood itself and more about what the wood is allowed to mean. A symbol, if it points beyond itself. A superstition, if it tries to act on its own. And the difference between those two is thin enough that most people cross it without noticing. Which might be why the gesture has lasted. It doesn't demand a clear belief, it just asks for a moment, a tap, a pause, a small interruption in certainty. Whether that moment belongs to God, to habit, or to something much older, depends on who's doing the knocking. Now, another explanation for knock on wood comes not from ancient religion, but from play. If the pagan theory gives the custom from a sacred past, the children's game theory gives it more of a concrete societal history. This version is especially appealing because it gives the custom a very human origin. A game, a rule, a moment of safety, and a child learning that wood means relief. The children's game theory becomes even more interesting when you think about how easily play hardens into instinct. Children are constantly making rules, breaking rules, and then inventing new rules with the complete conviction as though they have discovered the very structure of reality by accident. If a game teaches them that the wood means safety, the lesson does not stay neatly inside the game. It slips out into conversation, into habit, into the small body memory of an adulthood. Years later, someone may knock on a desk without remembering the old chase game at all, but the feeling is still there. Wood equals refuge, touch equals relief, and safety can sometimes be found in the nearest piece of furniture, which is a very practical philosophy, if not a very glamorous one. The central idea is simple. In an old British children's chasing game known as Ticky Touch Wood, or in a similar variant of Touchwood, a player could avoid being tagged as long as they were touching a wooden object. Wood, in that context, was not a mystical substance or a sacred relic. It was a rule. It marked a brief zone of protection. Once a child touched wood, they were safe from pursuit, at least for the moment. The action created a tiny but meaningful suspension of vulnerability. This matters because the structure of the game closely resembles the structure of superstition. In both cases, contact with wood produces safety after a moment of risk. In the game, the risk is physical capture. In everyday speech, the risk is, of course, bad luck, misfortune, or jinxing of a fortunate situation. The logic is not identical in content, but it is strikingly similar in form. Touch wood, you're protected. Touch wood, and the danger is postponed. Touch wood, and the vulnerable moment becomes briefly secure. That makes the game theory especially attractive from a historical standpoint. Unlike the broader pagan and Christianity explanations, which are typically rich but difficult to document with precision, the children's game account points to a recognizable social practice that could plausibly help spread the phrase in ordinary speech. Children are excellent little historians. They simplify rules, repeat gestures, and somehow turn a playground trick into a lifelong reflex. A game that treats wood as a marker of safety can easily teach the body to associate wood with protection. Over time, that association can outlive the game itself. In that sense, superstition may not have begun as an abstract religious belief at all. It may have begun as embodied learning. A child who learns that wood means safety in a game can later carry that intuition into adult life, where the same gesture is reinterpreted in a new context. The rule changes, but the feeling remains. What was once safe from being tagged becomes safe from being jinxed. The surface meaning shifts, but the emotional logic survives. That is probably why this theory feels so satisfying. It doesn't require a sacred grove, a theological framework, or a hidden code passed down through the centuries. It just requires children being children, which is to say, making up rules, repeating them, and somehow producing customs that survive long after nobody remembers where they came from. It is a very efficient system, if you think about it. Slightly chaotic, but, well, efficient. This is one reason game theory is so useful. It shows how a ritual can emerge from ordinary behavior without requiring a grand theological design. Not every superstition begins in a temple or grove. Some begin in the playground, where rules are repeated until they become instinctive. A phrase like knock on wood may have been preserved because it was so easy to remember, easy to perform, and already linked to a familiar idea, wood as a place of refuge. There is also something culturally important about that transition from game to superstition. It suggests that the line between play and ritual is thinner than we often assume. Children rehearse the social world through games. They learn symbols through action. They assign meaning to touch, to movement, and to boundaries. If a game teaches them that touching wood creates safety, then that lesson can easily be carried into adulthood, where it takes on the more serious language of luck, caution, and fate. So from a scholarly perspective, the children's game theory does not merely offer an alternative origin, it offers a mechanism. It explains how the custom could have been widespread in a form that ordinary people recognize immediately, even if they no longer remembered where it came from. The gesture survives because it was practical, memorable, and physically intuitive. Wood becomes temporary refuge, first in play, later in life. That is what makes this theory so compelling. It does not have to require us to choose between history and psychology or between ritual and habit. It shows how a simple childhood rule can harden into a cultural instinct. And once that happens, the original game can fade away while the gesture remains, still carrying the old meanings of safety, even when the players are long gone. You know, what's funny to me is that each theory seems to solve a different part of the same tiny mystery. Paganism gives it atmosphere, Christianity gives it reinterpretation, and the playground gives it a way to survive in ordinary life. It shows how a gesture of safety can move from play to adult superstition, carrying the old meaning forward even after the original game was forgotten. The pagan explanation is the most atmospheric, and in some ways the most intuitive, because it fits a broad ancient worldview in which trees were sacred and the natural world was alive with unseen presence. It gives a custom depth and symbolic weight, but is also the hardest to prove in a direct historical sense. That makes it valuable for interpretation, but less secure as a strict origin claim. The Christian explanation is similar in that it works as a reinterpretation rather than a clean starting point. Wood could be linked to the cross, and the gesture could be read as a symbolic act of protection under Christian meaning. But again, this tends to explain how the custom could have been reframed, not necessarily how it first began. The children's game theory is different because it offers a concrete pathway from practice to habit. A game in which touching wood made a child safe from being tagged creates a structure that closely resembles the modern superstition. The gesture becomes intangible, not just as symbolism, but as learned behavior. That makes it especially useful if you want to stay scholarly and careful. People do not need to fully understand a ritual for it to spread. They only need to repeat it in a situation where it feels effective. A playground rule can easily become a cultural reflex if it teaches the body that the wood equals protection. In that sense, the game theory explains not only where the phrase may have come from, but why it was memorable enough to survive. It also helps reconcile the older explanations instead of forcing a choice between them. Pagan and Christian meanings may have shaped the symbolic atmosphere around the custom, while the children's game give it a practical, repeatable form. That is often how traditions actually develop. Old ideas provide the symbolism, and lived behavior provides the transmission. And honestly, that's very on brand for humans. We take one small thing and give it 3 original stories, a few rituals, and a surprising, confident tone. Now, the argument shifts from origins to persistence. Even if the old pagan meanings, the Christian reinterpretation, and the children's game theory all help explain the gesture developed, they do not fully explain why it still feels natural today. This is where psychology and habit come in. The modern practice of knocking on wood survives because it answers a very old human problem: uncertainty. People may no longer believe that trees house spirits or that a touch on wood will literally change fate, but the feeling behind the gesture remains. When something is going well, people become alert to the possibility that speaking too confidently might invite misfortune. The knock is a way of managing that unease. If you're near something wooden, this is your moment. Say one thing in your life that's going surprisingly well right now, either out loud or in your head, and as soon as you finish that sentence, actually knock on wood just once. Psychologically, it makes perfect sense. A tiny ritual gives anxiety somewhere to go. They do not solve the problem, but they give the mind something to do with the fear. A tap on wood creates a momentary sense of control, which is often enough to make a person feel more settled. The gesture works not because it changes the world, but because it changes the speaker's relationship to the world. And that is where the psychology gets really interesting. Because rituals like this do not survive only by being believed. They survive by being useful to the nervous system. A tiny gesture can interrupt a spiral of worry long enough to make a person feel steadier, and that emotional pause matters more than we like to admit. Humans are very good at living with uncertainty until the moment that they are not. Then we start reaching for habits, phrases, lucky objects, and small motions that help us feel as if we have done our part. Knocking on wood is one of the cleanest examples of that instinct. It takes a vague fear and gives it somewhere to go. The future does not become less uncertain, of course, but the body gets a moment of relief, and sometimes that's enough to keep going. This is also why the custom survives even among people that would never describe themselves as superstitious. So, I have a quick activity for you. Quick little superstition scorecard. I want you to count how many of these are true for you. Number 1, you knocked on wood in the last week. Number 2, you've ever said, "I'm not superstitious, but," and then done something superstitious. Number 3, you have a lucky object, outfit, or number. Number 4, you repeated a ritual you don't actually believe in, just in case. And number 5, you picked up a habit from a childhood game that you still do as an adult. If you scored 3 or more, you're in the very normal, very human zone where habit, game, and anxiety all shake hands. Whether or not you think knocking on wood, quote-unquote, works, your nervous system clearly likes having backup plans. Habits are powerful because they keep going long after the mind has stopped explaining them. A person may not think that wood has special powers, yet still knock on it out of reflex, social conditioning, or emotional memory. At that point, the gesture has become less a doctrine than inherited behavior. It is learned in childhood, reinforced in conversation, and repeated so often it feels almost automatic. What makes a ritual like this endure is that it solves a problem people never really stop having: in uncertainty. Even when the original meaning fades, the action remains because it still does useful emotion work. It gives people a sense of control, a moment of pause, and a shared way of handling luck, fear, or hope without needing to explain themselves. That is why rituals keep appearing in new forms across cultures and generations. The details change, but the human need behind them stays the same. And yes, even Taylor Swift has reminded us that the phrase still has plenty of life left in it. So the modern habit is the endpoint of a longer process. What may have begun as sacred contact, ritual safety, or a playful rule becomes, over time, a socially shared response to good fortune and fear of reversal. The ancient meaning matters, but the present-day force of gesture lies in its psychological usefulness. It gives form to caution, it turns vulnerability into motion, and it allows people to feel, however briefly, that they've done something to guard a fragile moment. And frankly, it's nice that the human species can build a whole little emotional safety net out of a tap on furniture. You could almost say we are one cautious species with excellent access to desks. In the end, that may be the real reason Knock on Wood survived. It is not simply an old superstition, and it's not just a leftover phrase from a more mystical time. It's one of those tiny human strategies for living with the fact that the future is forever a little out of reach. The gesture is brief, ordinary, almost invisible, but it reveals something lasting about us. When the future feels fragile, we reach for anything that makes it feel a little bit more stable. Sometimes that means a prayer, sometimes a habit, or sometimes just a quick tap on wood. And maybe that's the best part of the whole thing. We don't need to fully understand the ritual for it to work on us emotionally. We just need to feel for one small moment that we've done something. That might not sound like much, but it's enough to keep a custom alive for centuries. Thanks, y'all, for joining me today. It really means a lot to have you listening. I'll catch you in the next one. And just like that, this week's obsession comes to an end. Thanks for getting wonderfully lost with me. If you'd like to keep this cozy corner of the strange alive, everything you need is waiting in the notes below. Or head over to my website, mylatestfixation.com, where the magic quietly hums. You can browse peculiar merch, learn the story behind the show, or leave a little offering. Spend $50 or more and you'll get free shipping. Have a dark history footnote, a lonely cryptid, or digital mystery you think I absolutely need to fixate on? Send your thoughts via carrier pigeon, if you can find one with a good sense of direction. Otherwise, the website worked much better. And if you enjoyed your stay, share the show with another kindred spirit. That's how our tiny, haunted hearth keeps growing. Stay curious, stay obsessed, and stay human.